Hi and welcome to my channel, Ricky Bologna Books. If you like hard-hitting and action-packed war novels, please click on the link in the description page for a free download of Steele's Dien Bien Phu. I would also like to recommend an excellent book by Andrew J. Mitchell entitled The Tigers of Tonkin, The History of the French Foreign Legion in Indochina, 1883 to 1945. The following chilling radio conversation was recorded between Torpal Ali Atgeriev, the commander of the Chechen forces defending Grozny, and Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Alexievich Savin, who was the commander of the 131st Maikop Motor Rifle Brigade. According to many accounts, both men had gone through the Russian military academy together and fought alongside each other in Afghanistan.
Алик, давай, может быть, как-нибудь, пока не поздно, отведите ребят, Алик, не делайте это, не надо. Вы в любом случае, Алик, пойми, и ты погибнешь, и я погибну. Что с этого толку будет? Сам правильно пойми, кто от этого выиграет. Мы же от этого с тобой не выиграем, понимаешь? Если я тебя увижу в бою, понимаешь, что ты отлично, не отлично, уже я тебя щадить не буду, так же, как и ты меня, понимаешь? Ты лучше ко мне как гость приедь, Алик. Отводи ребят, не надо, пожалей их матерей, пожалей их самих, отводи ребят, Алик, дай команду. Ой, я не такой большой начальник, чтобы давать такие команды. Алик, ну ты правильно пойми, я, например, тебе просто от сердца, да, и чисто желаю, чтобы ты живой, конечно, остался, но уйди лучше. А я такого выбора не имею, у меня есть приказ, и я его выполню в любом случае.
On the 11th of December 1994, Russian forces attacked into Chechnya on three axes, all aimed at the Chechen capital Grozny. By late December, all three columns had reached the outskirts of Grozny in the west, north, and the east. Two units, the 131st Maikop Brigade and the 81st Motor Rifle Regiment, launched mounted attacks into the city. The 131st Maikop Brigade first seized the airports on the outskirts of the city unopposed. Then it was ordered to continue the attack to seize the downtown railway station, its lead units arriving by early afternoon. The 81st Motor Rifle Regiment was ordered to thrust into the city from the north, also towards the downtown area. In retrospect, it's clear that the Russian commanders expected any Chechen resistance to melt away at the arrival of the armored forces, and the crisis would be resolved without any significant fighting by rapidly seizing the presidential palace. Instead, the Russians' initial success proved illusory. Soon both Russian units would be engaged and fighting for their lives against skilled swarms of Chechen infantry, armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. Over the next 3 days, the 131st Maikop Brigade would be totally destroyed, with only a handful of survivors among its 1,000 troops, and the 81st Motor Rifle Regiment would suffer 50% casualties. The Russians' lack of advanced planning placed them in stark contrast to their adversary. According to Russian sources, Chechens had been preparing for the Battle of Grozny for at least 3 to 4 months before Russian troops entered the city. During this time, they developed war plans, divided up zones of responsibility, trained their militia, and set up effective communications. In fact, they were putting into practice all the things that Soviet analysts had identified as key lessons of World War II. Russian press descriptions of the rebel force as a set of loose groupings of bandits was inaccurate. The rebels were well armed and drilled. The Russian soldiers in the Maikop Brigade were for the most part young conscripts with very basic training and no experience. Recruits had fired a few magazines and thrown grenades during training, but many had only around 6 months' service. They were hastily put together to strengthen the unit. Most of the men did not know each other, and many of the officers were straight out of the military academy. When the Russians entered the city, many of the units did not have maps. To compound the problem, the Chechens had changed many of the suburb and street names in the city. As it was New Year's Eve, many of the conscripts were said to have been asleep in the APC troop compartments when they drove into Grozny not expecting resistance. Most of the Chechens spoke Russian and listened into the Russian radio messages or gave conflicting orders to the advancing Russian columns using real Russian call signs. The Chechens are rumored to have relied heavily on cell phones. The first detachment arrived at the railway station and took up their positions. Initially, there was no response from the Chechens, as they were confused by the 131st positions at the railway station. They were between the outer and inner defense lines of the presidential palace, placing the 131st right in the middle of the Chechen defenses. They let them in and watched from the buildings surrounding the station. The 1st Battalion occupied the train station building, but because of a radio blackout, they were unaware that the 2nd Detachment had been ambushed and forced to withdraw. They were separated from the 2nd Battalion from the freight station to the west and from the 3rd Battalion on the outskirts of the city. At the railway station, an officer of the 131st received a radio call which simply stated, "Welcome to hell." 20 minutes later, all hell broke loose. Shortly after, Chechen defenders in the depot buildings, the post office, and the 5-story building surrounding the station opened devastating automatic and anti-tank fire. Chechen fighters fired rocket-propelled grenades at the Russian APCs from buildings, hitting the top of the vehicles where the armor was thinnest. Russian troops could not elevate their main guns high enough to target the Chechens on the roof, or to press the guns low enough to fire on those who shot at them from the basement windows. The surviving Russian troopers took cover inside the station. Then the Chechens completed the ambush by setting it on fire. The Russian commanding officer, Colonel Ivan Alexeyevich Savin, radioed for help and artillery fire, but help never arrived. In the initial stages of the firefight, Colonel Savin was wounded. A mortar shell exploded close by. Savin grabbed his leg and shouted for someone to take off his boot. There was a piece of shrapnel sticking out of his leg. He screamed at a captain who came to his aid, cursing him to pull it out. Most distress calls of the 131st went unanswered. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the brigade responded to the call for help, but were blasted in layered ambushes before reaching the station. At first, the 131st Maikop Brigade held a few of the buildings around the station, but they had to withdraw to the main railway station buildings later. After a small element of the 503rd Motor Rifle Regiment received orders to move during the early hours of the day, they immediately received friendly fire from other Russian forces. Bogged down under heavy fire, they fought each other for 6 hours. There were many more such incidents, some of them organized by the Chechens. The 8th Corps reached the city center from the north, but were unable to save the units fallen into the ambush. No Russian reinforcements reached the railway station. The men of the 131st were constantly under heavy Chechen fire, particularly from a 5-story house directly across the square from the station building. It was dubbed Pavlov's house by the Russians. From this position, the Chechens constantly fired on the Russians with rocket launchers and machine guns from the windows and the roof. At sundown, Colonel Savin decided to evacuate the wounded via the only 3 working armored personnel carriers left. After loading 30 wounded troopers on top of and inside each APC, they moved out, but in the wrong direction. They moved towards the center of the town. They eventually turned around to retreat along the same route, but were ambushed by Chechen anti-tank gunners. The first APC was hit 3 times. The first RPG hit the right-hand side troop compartment, killing everyone in the right-hand side of the vehicle. 2 more rockets hit the left-hand side of the vehicle. Of the 3 vehicles that left the station, only a total of 13 crew and passengers survived to be taken prisoner. The first attempt to evacuate the wounded from the station failed. There was no second attempt, as there were no serviceable vehicles left. The wounded would have to walk out on foot with the others if a breakout was attempted. The Chechens surrounded the station, taking up positions 10 to 15 meters away. Confident that they could take out the Russian positions at any given moment, the Chechens sent out a captured Russian officer of the Maikop Brigade by the name of Lieutenant Vladimir Adonin with an offer to surrender. They warned him that if he rejoined his comrades in the station, or if he ran away, they would kill some of the Russian prisoners. Lieutenant Adonin went to the station, but returned with a negative on the surrender proposals. The Chechens then shot him afterwards. On the outskirts of the city, a hastily formed column attempted a rescue mission. The column was blocked in the narrow streets by Chechen fighters, quickly taking out the lead vehicles first, and then the rear vehicles, with rocket-propelled grenades. At a more leisurely pace, they then destroyed the rest of the trapped column. 3 vehicles managed to get within sight of the station, but then were destroyed. The Chechens knew that none of their own vehicles were in the city, so they hunted down the Russian vehicles by their engine noises. By this time on the second day, the Russians had between 60 to 70 wounded men at the station. The Russian medic said that the wounds ranged from the extremities to head and lung wounds, and many of the wounded would die soon. Soldiers gave their wound dressings to their injured friends, while others gathered up whatever could be used as a bandage. They were down to between 2 to 4 magazines per soldier and 6 to 7 magazines for the officers. At 1600 hours on January the 2nd, 1995, Colonel Ivan Savin decided to withdraw all the remaining units of the 131st Brigade and the 81st Regiment from the area they occupied. The relief columns fighting in the neighborhoods adjacent to the station square were able to divert the main enemy fire and reduce the fire pressure on the railway station for more than an hour. For the evacuation of the wounded, it was necessary to find transport. For this purpose, a search group was organized. Drivers went out under cover of automatic fire. The first to start was a battered T-72 tank of the Maikop Brigade. The engine started up, a cloud of black smoke splashed out from the exhaust pipe, and almost immediately a rocket-propelled grenade hit the tank. The T-72 caught fire. An attempt to start a T-80 was also unsuccessful. This tank was knocked out almost immediately, though with much more serious consequences. The T-80's ammunition detonated. A tank turret weighing 6 tons was thrown 15 meters away by the explosion. The driver managed to leave the tank in time. They were able to get their hands on only 3 serviceable BMPs. Before the departure, all maps, operational documents, and the combat operation logs were destroyed by order of the brigade commander, Colonel Ivan Savin. Colonel Savin and the other wounded men piled onto the 3 BMPs. Retracing the route they had taken into the city, they hoped to reach friendly forces. After a few blocks, the first car the brigade commander was driving in was hit with a grenade launcher. Realizing the threat, the driver of the second BMP pressed the gas pedal to the floor and began to pick up speed, bypassing the stationary first car. Despite this, having passed no more than 50 meters, the second BMP was also stopped by a grenade launcher. The gunner could not return fire with the vehicle's main gun as the car was covered with wounded. The turret could not be turned without hitting people. Whoever could opened fire on the militants up in the buildings with their small arms. The first car, already stalled and motionless, came under heavy fire from grenade launchers. The BMP was hit at least 8 times by rocket grenades. A group led by Colonel Savin took refuge in the courtyard of a nearby motor depot. The Chechen militants approached the armored vehicles engulfed in flames, and they began to finish off the wounded. The surviving Russians fired on the Chechens. One of the Chechen militia threw a grenade. As a result of the explosion, the brigade commander was mortally wounded by a piece of shrapnel to the eye. Colonel Savin died, but saved the lives of many of his men by not waiting for a relief column and making it out of the city on their own. Colonel Sashenko found a car in the yard of the Volga motor depot. They decided to use this car as transport. The wounded were crammed into the car. They started the car and drove out of the depot. Senior Warrant Officer Shibikov remained to cover the retreat of his comrades. The survivors in the car managed to link up with a Russian unit close by, as did some of the walking wounded who carried their friends to safety. After the departure of the BMP-2s and the main group led by the brigade commander, the soldiers covering the withdrawal were able to start a T-72A tank. The remaining wounded were loaded onto the tank. The tank followed the railway sleepers out of the city. Chechen fighters began closing in on the Russians, who fired at them to keep the Chechens at distance. The group moved along the railway tracks and eventually arrived at a mountain slope, along which summer cottages were located. Here they had to leave the tank. The machine gun was removed and taken with them, along with the wounded, whoever could. Walked on his own, others had to be carried. A checkpoint appeared ahead. In the dark they couldn't tell who it was. After careful observation through night sights, they identified the soldiers as being Russian. The sentry warming himself on the front panel of a BMP noticed the officers and called out to them as they approached. These officers had been sent ahead as scouts for the main group. After identifying themselves, the scouts fired 3 single shots into the air. That was the pre-arranged signal that announced that they had found friendly forces. As it turned out, they had stumbled upon one of the units of the 503rd Motorized Rifle Regiment. The group that exfiltrated on foot from the station numbered 142 survivors, including the soldiers of the 81st Regiment. Of the 120 other armored vehicles were lost as well. The entire Maikop Brigade of over 1,000 men was wiped out in 60 hours. During this debacle, General Grachev proclaimed the entire city center and several districts of the city and its outskirts are under complete control of the Russian forces.
Ребята, расскажите, откуда вы выбирались? Сколько? Какие там вообще дела? И как вы туда попали?
Как откуда? Пришел приказ, послали 31-го. 31-го послали. Подъехали там первым. 10 часов 1 числа зашли. Зашли нормально, через наших стороны. Прошли к центру, ближе туда подошли и все. Стали на улице. Там такая армада танков, всякая ерунда. Подбитая все стоит. Постреляли, потом нас давай стрелять. Разгромили всю роту и все. Ну зачем?
А дальше что? Как вы попали?
Да. Попали. Зашли туда, не знаем же, ни улиц, ничего, первый раз. Ни табличек, ничего, по карте ориентироваться бесполезно. Так ехали наугад, куда пойдем. Всю роту разбомбили, еле выбрались на вокзал, там вообще добили. С вокзала выбирались каждый как мог.
Сколько вы выбирались?
Нет, 3 суток до своих шагал. Я ночью.
Ну и что за это время было?
Ну, что такое? Ну, как, за ночь мы добрались до своих, а там уже по полкам и своих искали. Уже думали, нас в списке пропавших без вести занесли.
Ну, с этими дудаевцами не сталкивались?
Сталкивались.
Ну, расскажи что-нибудь конкретное.
Сталины, сколько мы с ними стрелялись-то. Перестрелка была мощная вообще. Ну, БМП вообще разгромили.
Что, вдвоем?
А?
Вдвоем, что ли?
Нет, там сколько нас вышли на вокзал все, сколько нас, 3 машины выходило. Да, 3 машины вышли, там еще стояли. Оккупировали вокзал, отстреливались там. Вот мы с ними отстреливались, толку-то. Собрались, решили выходить на. Выходило 5 машин, я не знаю, где остальные. Ни одна, по ходу дела, не вышла.
А, короче, вы с техникой?
Ну, выходили, но потом уже пешком получилось.
И скрывались где-то?
По домам, по подворотням и скрывались, как обычно, пока темно. Ну, мы-то что, мы менены трагично вышли, конечно. Мы вдвоем вылезли. В подворотне скрывались, потом смотрим, наша колонна идет. На колонну выбрались. Там я не помню, какой полк стоял. Ну, за город вышли сразу же. За городом стоял полк. У них БМП-3, всякая машина. Мы туда выбрались. Ночь переночевали, хотели с ними обратно в город ехать. Так и не поехали. Поехали наших искать. Туда-сюда бродили. Все по-разному выходим. Кто как.
Чего добавить?
Да, что можно добавить?
Целую ночь ходил с шестом каким-то длинным, ну не шестая это, а пал какая-то, ходил с ней. И вот, увидев его, он еще за кустами был, речей как извивался, я быстро упал, так прыгнулся, а он все идет по этой тропинке. Но я тогда глаза закрыл и держал, на себе упала эта дубина большая на меня. Он прошел мимо меня, даже не остановился. Ну, мне показалось, что не остановился он. Ну, я правильно, у меня лицо само грязное это было. Наверное, за мертвеца сошел бы, наверное, за милую душу. А потом уже, как он прошел, я посмотрел, его нету. Я ноги в руки и быстрее от этого места. Ну, правда, потом уже там, они то ли заново начали прочесывать, меня обнаружили уже. Я когда уже подполз к новому, ну, Садовому кольцу-то, там блокпост хотел посмотреть. Смотрю, как раз БМПшки с нашей стоят. Начал ближе подползать. Смотрю, одна БМПшка без башни. Потом уже понял, что... Ну, мне потом, как сказали, это первая рота, там, полегла у нас. Вот это ихние БМПшки были. А так, ну, меня там вот обнаружили. Тоже начали прочесывать. Тоже убежал. Потом уже вышел на наших.
Много радости.
Радости, когда к нашим вышел. Конечно.
Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this. And please, if you did, hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you very much.